Well, I hope you're having a good day. This is Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. J. Warner Wallace, one of my favorite individuals and a terrific apologist and speaker, said this: "We as parents are the most important apologists our kids will ever know." Yeah, and he's exactly right. So I want to go back because of that, the importance of being a parent and being involved with helping your kids stay Christian with all of the challenges that are out there in this world today. Her name is Hillary Morgan Farrar, and she wrote a book called Mama Bear Apologetics. And it's called, subtitled, Empowering Your Kids to Challenge Cultural Lies. And it's so important. And you know what's good about this? Even if you're not a mama bear, if you're a guy that's just interested in apologetics, if you're a mama, you're female, but you don't have any kids, that doesn't matter. All of this is really important material. So it's good if you are a parent, but it works really well as good information if you're not a parent. So I'm going to go to chapter 3. I've done 2 previous podcasts on this, and I'm doing chapter 3, which is the discerning mama bear, right? So discernment. And what does that mean? Well, everybody has different ideas of discernment. So she says, what do we mean by discernment? She said it's identifying both good and bad. It said it's kind of like a food allergy, she says, to have biblical discernment. And you're going, what? She says, for example, in her case, she doesn't eat peas. She said, well, I can, but it's kind of nasty. So it said, if somebody was to serve me a delicious plate of fried rice with vegetables, the first thing I do is pick out the peas. I don't accept all the food. I don't reject all of it. That's culinary discernment. And so she says, using that as an analogy, she said, we as mama bears, our job is to help separate the good from the bad, to accept the good and reject the bad. Said kids are naturally culinary discerners. Yeah, they pick through their food as soon as you hand it to them. Says we have to train our kids to be discerning about what they feed their minds. She says that we want to keep our kids safe, but you can't protect them, right? You can't keep them in a bubble. You can't keep them in the house. You can't keep them away from society. She says part of keeping them safe is teaching them to discern for themselves. Gosh, I just think that's terrific advice. We can't just tell them this is right, this is wrong, pay attention to me, I'll let you know. Eventually, they get turned loose in the world, and they've got to make those decisions for themselves. She said when it comes to media, for example, you can't just label things safe or dangerous, or label them as Christian or non-Christian. She said you can't pick apart culture like you do food. I mean, you listen to a song, and you can't pick out the parts you want to hear and the parts you don't. I mean, you're just going to hear the whole song. And she said, there are no Christians that are so theologically sound that they're never wrong, and there are no atheists so bad that they've never been right. She said that doesn't happen. So that everything out there is going to be a mix of truth and error. And I think she's right. She said, so if you divide the world up and just say, well, that's safe, or something else is dangerous, or even say that's Christian or that's non-Christian, if you just make up those categories, she says the kids will eventually swallow a lie on something that they thought was safe or Christian. Or maybe they'll end up rejecting something they thought was dangerous or non-Christian. She said we need a new model. She calls it the chew and spit model. So she said she's a proud Texan, and she said beef is a part of our cultural heritage. And she said, boy, I love a good steak. And most steak eaters, she says, know that there's some pieces that make you keep chewing and chewing and chewing. That's called gristle. And you're supposed to discreetly spit that into a napkin without drawing attention. And then you keep on eating, right? That's chew and spit. We have to do it with food, she says, and we've got to do it with culture. And so she said, she'll use R-rated movies as an example. So she said, the movies that were R-rated in the 80s and 90s are today's PG-13. And she said it's hard for her to sit through a movie with an R rating because of swearing and sexual content. And she said I generally avoid them, but I don't make it a hard rule to do so. She said some R-rated movies have content that Christians can find to be of value. They may not have an atheist accepting Christ, but they may show part of reality that's valuable to acknowledge and can't be depicted without something disturbing in there. So she comes back to her point. She says, my point is A mature, informed, discerning worldview doesn't need to fear false messages that the world churns out if, and this is the big part, if it's already been trained to identify which parts to reject. See, I think that is really important. So I want to say that again in slightly different wording. So worldview is just, what does culture say about life and about humans and where we came from and what's really important? What's our problem? How do we fix it? So she said, if you're going to have a discerning worldview, and you've got a good one, right? If it's really solid, you don't fear false messages that come in because you've already been trained to identify this makes sense, this is part of the Christian worldview, and that's not, right? So you know what to keep and what to reject. Now, she says, what if we don't teach kids to chew and spit, right? She says that's like cutting your kids' food for them if you just tell them everything that they've got to believe in or not believe in. This is a good TV show, that one's bad. You can listen to this musician, not that one. She said that's okay when kids are little and they're kind of in the black and white stage of thinking. But when they get older, it's counterproductive. Why? Because they start thinking that if you just categorize something correctly, then they can turn their brains off and just be on autopilot. But she said there's no such thing as autopilot in the Christian life. She said, I've heard F-bombs from a pastor during a sermon. And she said, actually, Karl Marx made some good points in the Communist Manifesto. And one more time, she says everything is a mix of good and bad. She said one of the contributors to the book here says we're a mixture of marble and mud. That's good. So what's the key thing to this? She says we have to exercise discernment in response to everything that we hear and see. And we've got to train our kids to do the same. Otherwise, eventually your kid leaves home and either goes off to college or goes to work, and then they assume that whatever they're hearing is either going to be safe or not, and it may be a big problem. She said she's seen good, strong Christians go down some weird theological trails because they thought somebody that they was trustworthy, like a pastor, led them astray. So she says the other thing that can happen when your kids are under the impression that certain things are dangerous when they really aren't, she said at some point, they're actually going to find something good or true in this bad category. Now, they've heard you say, no, that stuff's bad, and then they find something that's good. And they feel like, my parents lied to me, or the church did, or maybe Christianity. And then they're wondering, well, if they lied to me about this, maybe they've lied to me about other things. So she said, we've got to train kids that refined art of chew and spit. We've got to build up, she says, their spiritual immune system. How do you do that? You got to teach them to interact with contemporary culture, and you got to swallow what's good, right? Take it in and spit out whatever's bad. But how do you do that? She said, well, you got to start by doing it yourself. She said, discernment is a process, and you don't stop once you just identified good and bad. You have to know why things are considered good and bad. Yeah, I agree. See, that's starting to get into apologetics. So she says, we have a guide for you. So he said, you're trying to protect your kids. That's really good. Here's what she says will help you. It's an acronym, ROAR, like, Mama Bear roaring. So ROAR. What does that stand for? R, recognize the message. What's the O for? Offer discernment. Affirm that it's good or reject the bad. A, argue for a healthier approach. R, reinforce this through discussion, discipleship, and prayer. So here's the deal. This book lays this out in every one of its chapters, those 4 steps. And I said, we're in a culture war, and we've got to use this ROAR method, she says, to identify a message, analyze its ideas. Okay, so let's go through those 4, and I'll have to go through them, I guess, fairly quickly, but I think we can do this. So ROAR, so keep that in mind, like roar. So number 1, the R, recognize the message. She said, here are some habits that would be helpful. Identify the message that's being presented. They may have one or they may have more, right? So what are they saying? And then number 2, identify which values the creators are pushing, what they think is useful. Is it freedom? Is it sex? Is it drugs? Is it pride? What are they putting down in their message? Humility, responsibility, traditional gender roles. Number 3, try to piece together what the worldview is behind the message. What do you think the person that put this out, what is their idea of good and bad? What's their idea of moral and immoral? What do they see as the good life that reflects what they would think of as success? Money, romantic relationship, freedom from rules. And she says, number 4, if you're watching a movie, identify which characters and qualities are shown in an attractive way, and what do the villains believe in. So often, they said, you can begin to see what are the key ideas they're pushing by who's the hero and who's the bad guy. Okay, here's a good idea. I like this one a lot. This is still under recognizing the message. She said, what if your kids are listening to a lot of music? What's their favorite song? We'll print out the lyrics and get together and go through the song line by line. What's the message? What's being communicated? What's being glorified? What's being put down? I like that a lot. There's your number 1 step. Recognize the message. Number 2, offer discernment. This is the O for roar. Offer discernment. So in other words, kids are kind of black and white thinkers, so we've got to show them that there's more to it than that, right? She said there are 3 skills. We have to see things accurately. You got to correctly find the good there. And number 3, you got to correctly find the bad. So she said our goal in discernment is to be accurate. What do our opponents believe? And then she said you got to identify where the good is. It might be a good idea or whatever. And then you have to acknowledge good intentions and the bad intentions. And she said it's really important to start with affirming the good first. All right, so it said we're not dealing with enemies. We're dealing with people that are like captives. They need help. So then identify the bad. What's wrong with what's being said in these movies or songs or whatever. All right, so there we go. So number 1 was, go back again, recognize the message, offer discernment to say, well, this is good, this is bad message. A, now we're on roar, R-O-A, argue for a healthier approach. So she said, what? She said, some people are going to say, you're teaching me to argue? I want them to stop arguing. We said, no. We're talking about arguing as giving reasons or citing evidence to support your idea. So that's what they mean by arguments. So she said, we have to argue for a healthier worldview. We've got to come up with reasons why we say one thing is good and one thing is bad. One thing is truth or one thing's a lie. She said, having a biblical worldview doesn't mean you just attach Bible verses to a statement and say, there you go. But anybody can take a verse out of context. We've got to know Scripture, yes, she said, but we need to know God and know the heart of God. She said, so many truths in Scripture get ignored, and then science shows them to be true. A biblical worldview, she says, helps us flourish with insights into human nature. It gives us principles of discernment, guidelines for society, and truths about what's really out there, seeing things as they really are. Okay, so let's go back one more time. R-O-A-R, we've done the R, recognize the message. O was offer discernment, looking at what's good, deciding that was good and something was bad. The A was arguing for a healthier approach. And then the last R in roar is reinforce through discussion, discipleship, and prayer. She said, it's not enough to find good and evil and even to provide reasons for the conclusions. If we stop there, it's like you trained for a test, but then you slept on exam day. She said, we got to live it out. So she said, it's not enough for our kids to hear us talk about the truth. They've got to understand how you live it out. And so I like this. At the end of every one of her chapters, she has conversation starters for the parents with the kids and some activities that might be helpful. And she said, our wars are principally a spiritual one. We have to prepare ourselves. So in another part of the book, they have a prayer section at the end of each chapter. So that's really, really good. So let me go through this, give you an idea of the discussion questions for this chapter that we just went through. So here's at the very end of the chapter. She's got 5 questions. Number 1, she calls it the icebreaker. What's the grossest thing you've accidentally eaten? Remember, she's talking about chew and spit. So that's just getting kids laughing and talking about things. Number 2, she calls this the main theme. Discernment means both affirming the good and rejecting the bad. So she said, what are some examples of things in pop culture that polarize people? Have you ever completely disagreed with someone about something you thought was bad? She said, pick something to discuss, maybe a TV show or a book or politics, maybe a politician, a way of thinking, and talk about the good and the bad there. What good can be swallowed? What needs to be spit out? Okay, that was the main theme part of her discussion questions. Number 3 in the questions, she calls it self-evaluation. What do you have a tendency to label things as either safe or dangerous for your kids? For what ages and personality types do you think this message is appropriate? For what ages or personality types might this method be inappropriate? Why? Here's her 4th question. She calls it brainstorm. What are some ways that you can take your children's media or interests and teach them to chew and spit? I like that because that puts it in the lap of the person reading this chapter. Now you take it, you do it. Well, how would you go about it? And then number 5, it's called Release the Bear. Pick one song or a movie that your child likes, and then sit down with them. If it's a movie, watch it with them or listen to it, and find the parts that align with God's truth and say, that's good, right? That's positive. I find the aspects that don't align with God's truth. And remind your kids how important it is that they do that kind of discernment with everything they read, everything they watch, everything they're listening to, and ideas as well. So let me go back real quickly because I think these are great discussion questions. Number 1, an icebreaker, just get the ball rolling, have some fun with it. Number 2, main theme was finding good and bad that's out there in culture. Number 3, evaluate yourself as a parent. Do we label things in a certain way that may not be real helpful for kids? Number 4, brainstorm. How can we get kids interested in teaching them how to chew and spit? And number 5, sitting down with them and picking a song or a movie and going through it with them. So that was the chapter there called The Discerning Mama Bear. Let me just, one more time, give you an idea of the chapters that are in here. We've done chapters 1 and 2. This is 3. Number 4 is called Linguistic Theft, How to Refine Words. Number 5, Self-Help, Gurus and what they're saying. How about this one, Naturalism? This world is all there is. There's no God. How about skepticism? How do you deal with skeptics? Postmodernism, moral relativism, pluralism, new spirituality, Marxism, feminism, progressive Christianity. All these things are covered in the chapters of this book. So I would highly suggest that this one is called Mama Bear Apologetics. People like J. Warner Wallace give it a thumbs up. Natasha Crane, Sean McDowell, Melissa Kane Travis, Craig Hazen, and on Mary Jo Sharp. I mean, people really love this book. It's worth it, and it's been out for a while, so who knows? Maybe you can find a paperback used copy someplace. But you would get a lot out of it yourself, even though, like I said, you may not have kids. But I hope that's helpful, and I hope you're having a good day, and we'll do another podcast soon. Thanks for listening.